Wealth management is not just for the wealthy. Everyone is entitled to their best retirement possible. Welcome to The Retirement Engineer with Jim Kruzan, your path to a bigger, bolder retirement. Brought to you by Kaydan Wealth Management, a firm that specializes in serving the mobility technology industry. In this podcast, we help you maximize your resources and engineer your best retirement through a process-driven approach so you can get the little things right. Drawing from years of expertise, Jim and his guests will simplify complex wealth management strategies and explore actionable ideas to help you protect your hard-earned wealth and take control of your future. Now, on to the show.
Did you know the average cost of college in the United States is a staggering $35,551 per student per year? Okay, that includes books, supplies, and daily living expenses, okay. But it's still a hefty price tag that can leave many parents and students feeling overwhelmed. Fear not. In this episode, we'll explore an intriguing tool that can help you save for education expenses while staying true to your retirement savings. Get ready to dive into the world of 529 plans and discover how they can be a game changer when it comes to funding your child's education. I'm Patrice Sikora with your host, Jim Kruzan. And Jim, let's start from the basics. What is a 529 plan? And do you need a financial advisor to open one?
Well, first off, it's good seeing you. Second, the 529 in its simplest definition, it's a qualified tuition program. It's an account that you can open, put money in to hopefully help offset college education cost in the future. You mentioned a moment ago that the average cost all in of a year at college is over $35,000. That's today. Mm-hmm. If we have a newborn who's not going off to college for 18 years, imagine what that 1 year cost is down the road, assuming that we just have normal inflation. Now, historically, it's changed a bit the last 3 years, but historically, education costs have been typically running at a multiple of normal economic cost. So you're looking at 5-6% annual cost of living increases. We're hoping those are moderating. We're beginning to see that, but just the same, that cost could be 2-3x by the time you actually get to sending your child off to school. And how does one do that and do that at the same time they're also trying to prepare for retirement? Right. It becomes very, very difficult. So these programs allow parents to either spend money today to lock in tuition cost or put money away in an account that hopefully can grow over time and satisfy some of these costs. There are two types of 529 programs that exist. There's the prepaid tuition plan, and that's exactly as it sounds. It's a program sponsored by a state where you would pay a cost today, which the state would compute as an average cost of an education today. And you would buy in at that current price. Then down the road, when the child goes to school, they would have that year of college at whatever the current cost is paid for.
But see, the questions, huge questions. What if the kid doesn't want to go there?
Yeah, there are some shortfalls. One of the first shortfalls is it isn't cheap. I can only speak for the state of Michigan. And right now, the buy-in for a credit hour is something like $612, which means for a full year, it's about $18,360 today for 1 year of tuition. And I said tuition. And we were talking about 35,000 as being all in, but there are a lot of other costs and expenditures involved in that. This is strictly tuition. So at best, you're covering somewhat half the cost.
Wow.
Then the other issue is the program only works if there's a presumption that the child is going to attend a public college within the state. If the child were to go to a private school, the benefits derived are significantly less. If the child elects to go to a public school out of state, the benefits are significantly reduced as well. And again, it's state based, so it's hard for me to comment, but I've seen penalties be as much as the parents simply get back what they put in.
Ooh.
So imagine putting $18,000 away today and then 18 years from now getting back essentially the same. In some cases, you're buying in at this average price set by the state. And then when you are using it for its intended purpose, because you're going to school elsewhere or not going to school or whatever the case is, what some states will do is give you back the absolute lowest current tuition within the state. So you might find that there's a big delta there.
Yeah.
Now, there's also an issue with the premium you pay. And what I mean by that is if you looked at the state of Michigan today and looked at the average cost of a 1-year tuition in a state university, you'll find that this $18,360 buy-in is a 20 to 30% premium over what that average cost is. So the state is kind of buffering some of their expenses by having a slightly higher buy-in. Now, over 18 years with some imputed inflation, it might still be a good deal, but you're certainly paying more today for that luxury of locking it in than what the true cost would be today. And then it is quite restrictive if the child were to go elsewhere. Now, there are some ways to get the money out without penalty. If the child, for example, were to go to a military school, a government military school, there are ways to get credit and get that money back out. Other distributions can be made, and they're a bit more flexible with the other type of 529, but the prepaid program is pretty rigid, pretty locked in, doesn't provide a lot of flexibility. The second program that is used quite often is a college savings plan. When people talk about 529s, they're usually talking about the college savings plan. And the best way to explain what that looks like from a tax functionality point of view, it's very similar. Consider it an educational Roth 401k. So think of it this way. You're putting the money in after tax. It's accumulating tax-free. And then when you pull it out for education purposes, it's coming out also tax-free, just like a 401k Roth would do. And like a 401k, a 529 would have its separate, unique set of investments, a menu of opportunity, so to speak. And you could pick amongst the fund choices, typically within that menu. You could elect a pre-formed portfolio. There would be a moderate or an aggressive or a conservative portfolio that you could just check off, and it would be built around an allocation of the fund choices that would be available. And typically you can also pick kind of an age-based or matriculation-based program. Simply put, it's a portfolio that's already pre-constructed, a portfolio that would automatically change over time. And the intent is for the program to be structured more aggressively to offer more growth opportunity, when the child is young. And as the child gets older and we get closer and closer to needing the money for education purposes, the account automatically morphs into a portfolio that looks a whole lot less aggressive, looks a whole lot more conservative. So you eliminate the risk of being very, very, very aggressive just before you need the money.
Got it.
I had a client who, he was a new client to the firm, and we were bringing in a number of accounts, and he had a 529 for his son, who was a senior in high school. And this was just during and shortly after the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And when we looked at the balance in the 529, it was about 40% less than it was about a year or so before. So imagine graduating from high school, somewhat needing some of this money, and realizing that the resources you thought you had have been now severely compromised. In his case, he had plenty of money, and as it turned out, his son finished college via an ROTC program, and then went into the military and is quite successful today. But it would have been devastating for a family whose child didn't choose that career path.
Right.
So having a plan that you don't have to think about, a plan that's automatically making those adjustments, can certainly provide some peace of mind, as opposed to thinking, oh yeah, I got this thing, I got to go in here and make some adjustments and see what that looks like. People rarely do that with their 401k. I doubt that they'll even go so far as to consider doing that with 529.
Well, why would a parent or a grandparent or whoever is going for the plan choose the prepaid versus the college savings? To me, the college savings sounds like it's more flexible. It's more realistic.
It's certainly more flexible, and we'll get into that in a little bit. It's there's also you're trading the known somewhat to the unknown. We don't know what the values will grow to in a college savings plan. We have some certainty that we'll have the tuition covered if we meet the criteria. They stay in state, etc. I've never considered opening up a prepaid tuition plan because families tend to be a bit more portable. They tend to move around. The idea that you're going to live and work and die within 30 miles of where you were born and your kids are going to do the same thing, that just isn't the way it is these days. So having a bit more portability. We've had situations where clients have bought a prepaid tuition plan in the hopes of covering the tuition component of the education cost. And then they've opened up a college savings plan and funding that on a regular basis to cover room and board and all the other expenses that creep up. And depending on the school, depending on the location, you might find that all the other cost outside of just pure tuition and fees is actually a greater expense than the tuition and fees alone. So by having the combination, you've got the tuition locked in, that's somewhat guaranteed. And then you've got the variable component as well. It's not unlike, and I'm not a super big fan of this, but it's not unlike somebody who, as a retirement planning, might elect to put money in an annuity that would then immediately start to draw a guaranteed source of income and have money in an IRA that would provide potentially greater growth and certainly greater legacy and inheritance opportunity. But it's also prone to a lot of ebbs and flows with respect to the market. So that combination might be just better for an individual's risk tolerance or psyche.
Do you have to have a financial advisor to open up a 529?
You do not. You can open very easily. You can open them directly through your state of residence. Many advisors have access to 529s. In our practice, we've always felt that higher education was important, whether it's college or an apprenticeship program or some other program, which, by the way, can be covered by the college savings plan. Hopefully, we'll get into that as well. So at our firm, we've always waived off on any fees, commissions, any of those types of things. So effectively, the cost to open an advisor-based program versus a state of Michigan program or some in-state program would essentially, to a large degree, be identical. There wouldn't be a huge plus or minus. Having an advisor that you're working with, a trusted advisor, who can help facilitate whether it's opening the plan at a state level or opening a advisor-based plan, hopefully with a waive off on fees, can certainly provide quite a bit of benefit because they'll be able to assist in terms of asset allocation and discussing the pros and cons of structuring the account. Either let's pick and choose funds, let's look at a preset portfolio, let's look at the age-based program and the benefits and cons of each.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, you were going to talk about qualified expenses. You said, we'll get into that. Let's get into that now. What are qualified expenses under these plans? And
Right.
do they vary from the different types of plans, the prepaid versus the savings?
Right. So with prepaid, it's essentially tuition and tuition-based fees. That's it. And it's really quite restrictive. And to a large degree, it's college. When we look at the college savings plan, which is the more flexible, think of that as the
Roth.
Exactly. There have been some changes in terms of what you can spend this on. Now you can spend it on, obviously, tuition. You can spend it on other expenditures. We'll go through that list in a second. But you can also spend up to $10,000 a year, meaning you can take a distribution off the 529 up to $10,000 a year per account for K through 12 education.
Oh, my.
Yeah. So you send a child to a parochial school, you are involved in certain programs, maybe summer school, maybe a special AP program that's tuition based. You can pull money out of a 529 to satisfy those expenses. Also, with a 529, you can pull money out and use it to cover things such as trade programs and apprenticeship programs, as long as they're tuition based, right? Okay. So if you're paying a fee, a tuition to be taught HVAC or plumbing or any of the other skilled trades, more than likely those would be qualified expenses. But when we talk about a child going off to college, the general expenses that we see are clearly tuition and fees. I don't think there's a huge amount of explanation needed there. Room and board, that would be the cost to have a child in a dorm. It can also cover cost of off-campus housing. So if there's cost involved in you're in some society living in a house, you can cover that. Off campus, there's many university sponsored housing programs that are not dorm related that would cover those living expenses as well. Books, supplies, equipment. It covers technology now, and that's been broadened out. So if you need a laptop for school, if you need another device for a hotspot or something, I suppose all those things would be covered under technology. If your child is special needs, and there were some special needs required to attend school because of the physicality of it, those things would be covered. If the child isn't college bound, but there are other programs of assistance, this is a little wonky, but you can pull up to $15,000 a year out of a 529 for that particular child and move it into an ABLE account, ABLE, which is a savings type account used to support children that are special needs. Now, we've got to be careful with that because if your child is special needs, more than likely they're getting assistance through Medicaid, and Medicaid is notorious for having clawbacks. So if there's money sitting inside a 529, Medicaid will never be able to claw that money back. But if there's money ending balance in an ABLE account, this would be the case in the event that a child passed away, Medicaid would certainly have the ability to reach in and pull those assets to offset the expenditures that they had. So if we're using 529 to support special needs via an ABLE account, it makes far more sense to move over, journal over periodically just the amount that you're expecting to spend. You really don't want to keep a sizable balance in that ABLE account for the reasons I mentioned. Right. So beyond that, there's, as I said, apprenticeship programs, et cetera. And I know, and I'm probably going to date this podcast, and I don't mean to, but there's a lot of talk today about student loans and paying back student loans and who needs to and perhaps who doesn't. Well, with a 529, you have the ability to pull up to $10,000 out and use that as a student loan repayment. And that's new. That's only that adaptation has only been available the last couple of years. So there's quite a bit of flexibility from the standpoint of being able to use one of these things for just about anything one would need to from a college expense perspective.
Now, is the account in the name of an individual child? Can it be used for other children, or does it have to be used for that individual?
So the account is quite portable, meaning that the owner of the account has the ability to move monies from one child account. The child is referred to as the beneficiary, from a beneficiary account to another account that would be established, let's say, for another beneficiary. Because of some changes that have just recently happened with regard to additional portability, and I think we'll get into this in a second, it certainly seems to be more preferable to open individual accounts for each individual child. So if a parent had two children, more than likely you'd want to own or open, I should say, two separate 529s.
But it's the parents who own the account.
Can be, doesn't need to be. Anybody can open a 529 for anybody else. We have parents who open them. We have grandparents who will open them. And there are cases where we have clients who have nieces and nephews, and they've opened 529s on behalf of those children as well. Depending on who owns the account, who opened the account, there are a few subtleties that we have to consider with respect to financial aid. At some point, when you send your child off to school, you undoubtedly will fill out the FAFSA form, which is the free application for federal student aid.
And the application's the only thing that's free, believe me.
Right. So the way that works is you fill out all the information, you provide information on income and those types of things. They're also interested in household assets, children's assets, etc. And then there's a determination, a calculation as to what amount of financial aid would be available. And that might be available from a variety of sources. There might be some scholarship programs. It might be some type of a student loan package as well. But depending on assets and location of those assets may, in fact, knock down or offset the amount of financial aid that a child may have the ability to obtain. So, for example, if a child owns assets in their own name, the FAFSA calculation will generally count 20% of those assets as being available for the child's education. So certainly that reduces the amount of financial aid or financial support that might be available. If there's a 529 that's owned by the parent on behalf of the child, there's actually a small amount of that value that also may negate the amount of money that's available for student loans. That amount is really small. It's 5.64%. So 5.64% of a balance in a 529 owned by a parent may reduce the amount of financial aid that would be available for the child. There are other factors involved as well, like parental household income. And depending on parental household income, there might not be a negation at all. So the fact that the household might have a low household income that would still, regardless of whether there was a 529 or not, may still afford the full complement of financial aid. The reason I mention that is with FAFSA, students are not required to manually report cash support. So if they have a grandparent out there who's putting money away, they don't have to disclose that. So as a result, a 529 that's owned by a grandparent for the benefit of the child doesn't even come into consideration when filling out FAFSA, and would not in any way reduce the amount of financial aid that a child might have available. So it's really, really interesting and can be, on the fringes anyway, impactful to have an account registered that way.
Are there downsides to a 529 limitation to a 520? We've gone through several of them, but are there any additional ones that you want to make sure people are aware of?
The biggest one is, this is an education account. So what happens if you use it for something other than education?
Right.
That's subject to a 10% penalty. That is the distribution would be. And to the extent that you're distributing gains would then be taxable. Remember, the account, like a Roth, you're putting it in with after-tax dollars. So when you pull it out, the only tax is on the gain. So if you're using it for education, it's tax-free. If you're using it for something other than education, the gains are taxable and there's a penalty. But the account's really quite portable, as I alluded. There's something called a qualified family member. And essentially, if you own the account, you can move balances around amongst quite a number of family members, the beneficiaries' siblings, nieces and nephews, step siblings, parents. So there's a lot of opportunity to get monies that are in a 529 to a student who might have a need to take a distribution for education purposes. There's also some flexibility when you do pull money out for non-education spend. Some programs provide flexibility to the extent of whose taxpayer ID is going to be used with respect to the gain. Is it the parent who owns the account, or is it the student who's the beneficiary? So if Johnny wants to take money out of his 529 to buy a Volkswagen microbus and an electric guitar, maybe Johnny should pay the tax on that at Johnny's tax rate, right? So there's some opportunity there to structure that. There's one other thing that's really unique about 529, and it allows advisors to kind of look beyond the scope of this is an account for education purposes. Under Federal Bankruptcy Code 541B, now I know everybody's aware of this. I won't go into detail about the bankruptcy code 541B. But what's really interesting about it is 529s are excluded from bankruptcies of estates, etc. So if you forced into a bankruptcy, they can't get at the money sitting in a 529.
That's interesting.
Let me give you an example. There's a very prominent group of physicians that run they're all OBGYNs. And years ago, they decided to disclose to their clientele that they were no longer carrying malpractice insurance because it's just ridiculously expensive, and it's driven so many excellent physicians just out of the industry, people retiring way too early because it makes the financials of running a practice just ridiculously difficult. And many of those doctors, as they're accumulating wealth for retirement, would superfund 529 accounts. And because they're the owner, they control the account, they can have 529s for their children, they can set them up for their nieces and nephews. And here's the thing, you can put a lot of money into a 529. You can put on an annual basis up to $17,000 a year, which is the annual gift limit. You can put in one fell swoop $85,000 in day one, which is essentially the first 5 years of payments right away. And there's really, to a large degree, no restriction as to how much money winds up in a 529. If you look at state code, the average max is well above 300,000. I think the state of Pennsylvania is something in the order of $516,000 can sit in an individual 529. I think North Carolina is very similar to that. So imagine having multiple 529s, each sitting with $500,000 at some point, and the only penalty is 10% on the back end, and you've had years and years of compounded deferred growth. The deferred growth alone will more than make up for the 10% penalty. And then the distribution is taxable on the gain. Seems like it's a fairly good way to protect assets against creditors. So I'm not saying that everybody should run out and do this, but if you have a profession that is prone to suits and liability, it certainly might be a way to use something like this completely outside of what one would normally consider the purpose of a 529.
All right. I only have two more questions, one of which is, can you open more than one 529 for someone? Same individual?
You can. An individual, a child can have multiple 529s. Each individual who's the owner of the account would be restricted in terms of funding to the gift limit. But as an example, if a parent opened the 529 for their child and subsequently a grandparent opened a 529 for the same child, who's now their grandchild, the granddad would be restricted to putting $17,000 a year away or less, and the parent would have the same provisos. Yes, you can have multiple accounts.
All right. And what happens if you don't use it all?
Yeah. Well, it's somewhat flexible. As I said, we have the ability to change the beneficiaries. We can move it from one child to another. We have two children. Let's say one goes to military school or has a full ride scholarship. The other one might use the money more. You can move the money from one account to another. You can move it to grandchildren. You can move it to nieces and nephews. So to a large degree, if the intent was, hey, the money was saved and I was hoping to be able to use it for college education, you probably could find a deserving family member who can use that money. The other thing that you can do with it, and this is new, and it really goes into effect actually next year, 2024, and it came about as a result of some legislation the end of last year. Now, and this is also the reason I'm suggesting that we open up individual 529s. Now, if we get to a point where a 529 has been opened for 15 years, so think of a newborn, now we have a 15-year-old, or we have somebody who's already completed college expenditures. They're in their early 20s. You can now move up to $35,000 out of a 529 into a Roth IRA for the beneficiary. Now, the 35,000 would be treated as annual contributions. So, as an example, if the annual contribution rate right now is $7,000 a year max, it would take about 5 years to move that 35,000 over, and every contribution you made as a result of moving it out of a 529 would be considered that year's contribution. So a child wouldn't be able to, in the case, fund a Roth for themselves in addition to this money that's being moved over. But it's a great way of getting money into a tax-free account for a very young adult who then has many, many decades of hopefully really good compounded growth. Absolutely. That works really very well. In addition to that, as I said before, the penalty to pull money out is 10% and taxation on the gain. So if you've been compounding this for 20 some years and decided you want to use it for something else, you certainly could, which is really helpful. This is by far the best tool out there to put money away for a college education program. It is vastly superior to some of the other programs that are available. One such program is called the Coverdale IRA. It's been out for a number of years. And there are some people who use it. We've rarely used it in our practice. But right off the bat, there's some restrictions. There's an income restriction. You can't have household income as a single person exceeding 110,000 or as a couple 220 and open this. So it's really available for folks who have lower income cash flow issues. 529, you can open it anytime, no restriction, no requirement in terms of income. With the Coverdale, you can only put $2,000 a year away. And we've already talked about the amount of money you can pump into a 529, vastly superior. With a Coverdale IRA, you can only fund this until the child or the beneficiary is 18. That's it. Can't fund it when they're beyond 18. With a 529, I'm 64. I could open up a 529 for myself right now and start funding it if I wanted to. The other thing is the Coverdale is a lot like an IRA. It's a Coverdale IRA. So think of that as an account you're opening, and it's self-directed. So, you could own anything you wanted to. If you wanted to buy shares of Microsoft, you could do that. Whereas, the 529 is more like a 401k. There's usually a menu of opportunity choices available. Spending is the same for tuition. In the case of Coverdale, you can spend money for college tuition. You can spend money for K through 12 tuition, and that's the same for 529. There's a little bit of a subtle difference in terms of expenses. As we talked about a moment ago with 529, you can cover tuition and college expenses. In the case of K through 12, from a 529, you can only cover tuition.
Okay.
In a Coverdale, you can cover both. But again, the big problem with Coverdale is you can only put $2,000 a year away. Yeah. And a lot of the private K through 12 schools are certainly well in excess of $2,000 a year tuition. In the case of Coverdale, distributions are tax-free. In the case of 529, they're tax-free as well. And also, and we really didn't touch on this, there may be a little bit of a tax benefit in 529 that isn't available in Coverdale at the state level. Some states, not all, provide either deductibility of contributions going into a 529 at the state level, or in some cases, they offer a tax credit. So many states offer some tax relief if you, the owner, is funding a 529 in a state of residence.
All right.
So there's some gamesmanship. If you're funding things for grandchildren, let's say, who reside out of state, do you use the state program that you live in or the state program that they live in? 529 it's based on federal law. So the distributions, unlike the tuition plan, have no bearing on where the child goes to school. So we're covering tuition, fees, etc., whether the child is in-state, out-of-state, public, or private. So when we consider a tuition-based program against a college savings program, in terms of totality, the college savings program certainly offers a whole lot more flexibility.
Jim, again, a great discussion. Thank you very much. So, listeners, in this episode, we did jump into the world of 529 plans, and we discussed how they can be a game changer when it comes to saving for your child's education. We learned that a 529 plan is a special savings tool designed specifically for education expenses, offering some tax advantages and flexible use of funds. We also discussed qualified education expenses, which include things like tuition, room and board, books, but even student loan repayments. And hey, we even tackled some common questions like how 529 plans compare to other savings options and whether grandparents can contribute. Now, armed with this knowledge, you are ready to make some smart choices in your child's education while also remaining loyal to your retirement savings. It's a win-win. Do it. Please be sure to subscribe to the Retirement Engineer podcast too, so you don't miss future episodes. And of course, follow at Kaydan Wealth on social. Let us know what you think in the comments. Please share topics you'd like us to discuss and follow and share. That will help this small show make a bigger impact. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Retirement Engineer.
Thank you for listening to The Retirement Engineer with Jim Kruzan. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Visit our website at www.kaydanwealth.com or give us a call at 800-638-6900. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of Jim Kruzan and this episode's guests, not necessarily those of Kaydan Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.